What is up, ladies and gentlemen? Daniel here with a deck tech on a deck that I like to call Torpor Beef. Now, this deck is not polished, it doesn't even have a sideboard right now, but it can definitely win games against real decks. It obliterates Malirapod, and I've also won against Delver, Boggles, and Splinter Twin. At the center of the deck is this card, Torpor Orb. In a previous video I talked about how I like Strionic Resonator because just about every creature that's good enough to play does something when it comes into play. Turns out that other people agree with that assessment, which is why a huge number of creatures that see play in real decks do something when they come into play. Torpor Orb turns that off. Entire decks crumble to Torpor Orb, earning it a spot as one of the most used sideboard cards for decks that can afford to run it. What if we built a deck that not only doesn't get hurt by Torpor Orb, but actually benefits from it? Then we could run it in the main deck and get free wins in game 1. Better yet, since Torpor Orb only costs 2, if you're on the play it comes down before most counter magic is realistic. On the draw it still often comes down before a counter magic is there, unless you're playing against straight control that runs a whole lot of that sort of effect. So what is the win condition in this deck? I went through a few, and I landed on Hunted Horror. If I have to play it without a Torpor Orb out, it's better than most of my other options. It has trample, so it's not going to be bested by random lingering souls. The downside of course is that it's double black, so I have to play a decent amount of black sources in my deck. It's not resistant to all forms of removal, but it does dodge Lightning Bolt, Doomblade, and Dismember, so that takes out a lot of the removal out there. In combo decks it's good to have redundancy. While nothing does exactly what Torpor Orb does, Trickbind comes close and has its own upsides as well. We would need 4 mana to cast Hunted Horror and Trickbind in the same turn, but that's not particularly difficult to get to. It also has split second, so it's effectively uncounterable. If we don't need it for the combo, it can also be used like Stifle, where we basically kill a fetch land. Trickbind is rarely played in Modern, so people don't really play around it like people play around Stifle in Legacy. I've also used Trickbind to counter Grizzlebrand's activated ability, which felt insanely good. You might notice that so far every card we've listed costs 2 mana. Because of that, a card like Muddle the Mixture turns from decent to really good. We can transmute for either half of our combo, but like Trickbind it has another use. If you don't need it to find a combo piece, we can just use it as a counterspell. It's even reasonably costed for a counterspell, so you never feel that bad using it in that mode. Dimir Infiltrator is currently in the deck, though I must admit it's the most likely thing to get cut at the moment. Like Muddle the Mixture, it can tutor for either half of our combo. It can also be used as a reasonable blocker, or to put in the last few points of damage, but it's pretty unremarkable at both of those secondary jobs. Next up we have Thoughtseize. This deck used to be blue-red, but my local game shop employee suggested pairing my deck with Hand Attack instead of Burn, and I have to say I've been very impressed. Just knowing what they have in hand is huge. Being able to take something is extra nice. With this deck it's even a bit better than normal because you get to make really weird choices that your opponent comes to understand later. Like for example, letting them keep their Eternal Witness because you know that you're going to play a Torpor Orb before they get to play the Witness. Inquisition of Kozilek is basically just 4 more copies of Thoughtseize. It has its own pros and cons and it's not exactly the same card, but for our deck it plays exactly the same as Thoughtseize really. It's possible I'll go down to less than 8 of this sort of effect, and I'm not sure right now if I would cut Thoughtseize or Inquisition, but right now I'm running all 8. Next up is Serum Visions. This is probably the second thing to go if I ever need to make some cuts. It's never a horrible card, and it does give us something else to do on turn 1, but eventually you reach a point where every card is gas, or a card that can tutor for gas, and you don't really need Serum Visions. I don't think this deck is there yet, but I won't be sad to cut Serum Visions when that day comes. Victim of Night is currently the only kill spell in the entire deck. With Hand Attack and a super low curve, I don't often need to kill something. I haven't played enough matches to know if this is even the correct kill spell. Maybe it'll become Go for the Throat or Doomblade or Dismember. Maybe I won't play any kill spells in the main deck and they'll only live in the sideboard. Or maybe I'll wind up cutting Serum Visions for even more kill spells. Only time will tell. The last non-land card in the deck is Mana Leak. I've mostly been using this to protect against kill spells when I'm ahead and protecting against early pressure when I'm drawing poorly in the early game. Not much to say about this, it's just a counterspell. My mana base is pretty simple and it's mostly a bunch of 4-ofs. We'll start with Verdant Catacombs. Our win condition is double black and all of our protection requires blue, so we do need both blue and black on turn 1 usually. Verdant fetches Watery Grave just fine. I think that a black fetch land is correct. It's possible that I want a blue fetch and we'll wind up running Misty Rainforest or something. maybe I'll decide to run more than 4 fetches total and wind up running both. Next up is Watery Grave, the most common fetch target for Verdant Catacombs. There's nothing too special to say about this, it's just a land that gives us both blue and black, which we desperately need. Next is Dark Slick Shores. Nothing on our main deck costs more than 2 or 3 if you want to use it as a tutor. Dark Slick Shores is better than Drowned Catacomb for that very reason. We need our lands to come in untapped, and this one always will, unless we have so much mana that we just don't care anymore. Currently, I'm running 2 Halimar Depths. I haven't yet felt bad for doing so, but I'm going to keep a close eye on it because coming into play tapped is a pretty big downside. I think after I get a good handle on its pros and cons in this particular deck, I'm going to try out things like Fairy Conclave, Mutavault, and Buried Ruin in the same slot. This also works pretty well with Verdant Catacombs. The sequencing can be a little bit awkward, but being able to shuffle away just really horrible draws is pretty nice. Next we have 3 islands and 3 swamps. We're fairly even on our 2 colors in the main deck. It's possible this should be split more towards black since it's the only color we absolutely need to win, but in most games where the opponent isn't a fishbowl, it feels like I need blue pretty highly as well. For now I'm punting and going even on the basics, though with Halimar Depths that does mean that I'm slightly ahead in blue sources. Well, that's the deck. It's a lot of fun, and I haven't found a matchup yet that's impossible to win. There are some tier 1 decks that have a really rough time beating us as well. We also aren't super vulnerable to most hate in the sideboards. We don't use a graveyard at all, for instance. We can catch a bit of splash hate from Affinity, but we aren't even hit by all forms of Affinity hate, so sometimes even that's a moot point. So far in my limited testing, this deck seems favored against most of the fair decks. If you're trying to play creatures and swing at me, I'm probably going to win. If you're trying to kill with Griselbrand or Phyrexian Obliterator or Karn, I feel like I can still win some games, but I have to get pretty lucky. If you're playing a combo deck, I actually don't know. Haven't played against many of those yet, surprisingly. Let me know what you think in the comments, and I'd love to hear about anyone actually running this deck. I'll be recording some MTGO matches soon, and I'll be taking this deck to my local shop once or twice a week as well, so you can probably expect a follow-up video about that. I'm also considering doing videos in the same style with some more established modern decks that I understand somewhat. If you would like that, let me know and I'll see what I can do. The most likely decks that would get coverage would be Living End, Adrak, and probably a really rogue deck called 7 Land Belcher.